Hello friends, this is the continuation of the previous video. In this video, we are learning the final keywords and we are discussing about the final keywords. So let's start the continuation of my previous video. So now we discuss the fourth point, which is when an array reference variable is declared as final. Only variable itself is final, but not the array element. What is the meaning of this sentence? Suppose you create a array. This create an array and you create this array with the final keywords. So this array will be called as a final array. So the reference variable, what is the reference variable for that? X. So X is final. You cannot reassign the to the X, but you can change the value of its element. Suppose like here, now if you want to change the size, here you create the array size is 10, but now you try to size of array 30. It will give the compile time error. But for the element, if you want to perform any changes, you can perform. So in the size cannot reassign new array object to the final array variable. Let's I show you on the Eclipse. So now you can see that we create a array with the final keywords. So here you have defined the size 10 and here you are trying to resize again. So it will throw the error because X defined is this array defined as the final array. So you cannot change in the reference variable, but you can change in the values. Suppose earlier you assign the second element as a 10 and here you print x2. So it will print the 2. And here you define x2 again. Okay, for a while we comment it and just run it. So earlier you assign the second index with the 10, so it give the output 10, and then you change the x2 value or second index value with 20, so it is printing 20. But if you try to reassign the array, it will throw the compile time error. Now the fifth point is when a reference variable is declared as final. Reference variable means object. When we create the object for the class, if you define that as a final, you cannot reassign a new object to it once it referring to an object, but you can change the state of an object to which final reference variable is referring. It means if you define a reference variable as a final, then reference variable cannot be changed, but the state means the variable held by that object can be changed. Suppose we define a class A with the integer value 10. Okay, and in that class, in the other class, we are creating a reference variable of a class which we define as a final. Now if you change the value of I which is present in the class A, you can change happily because the value is not final. But now if you try to assign a new object in the A reference, this is a reference and this reference is the final reference. Now if you try to assign a new object in this variable, this reference variable, you will get the compile time error. Okay, let's I show you. Suppose I create a variable int I equal to 10. Okay. Okay. Now I create the object test t equal to new test. Okay. Now I define this as a final. Okay. Now if I want to change this I value, first I will print this I value t dot I. What will be the output? 10. Now I would like to change this I value t dot I equal to 20. Then print it again. So the value of I is now 20. Okay. Now if I would like to try to test equal to, I am creating a new object of test class and assigning to it. It will throw the compilation error because t is defined as final. Final means not changeable. So it will not be changed. Means you cannot reassign the value to the final variable. Okay, so it is throwing the error. If you remove the final from here, you can easily assign the value. You will not get any error. So if you define a reference variable as a final, only the reference variable cannot be changed, or you cannot assign the new object to this reference variable, but you can change the object value or object state. Number 6 point is static variables, non-static variables and local variables all can be final. Means static variables you can define final, non-static variables you can define final, and local variables as well you can define final. Once the final variables are initialized, even you cannot reassign the same value. Okay, so here we create a class A, assign a value, we create a static final variable I and assigning 10. Final int j equal to 20, which is non-static variable. This one is a static variable, this is non-static variable, and we create a method 1 with final int k, and k is a final local variable. So k is a local variable and you are assigning k equal to 20. So local variable, in the local variable it gives the error because local variable you cannot define as a final. So here you create a class object, and if you try to assign the same value again, also then it will throw the error because you cannot assign the any value to the final variables once you have initialized it. So already you have initialized these variables values. So now if you are trying to initialize this value again, it will throw the error. Next point is, if the global variables are not initialized explicitly, they get default value at the time of object creation. But the final global variables don't get default value and they must be explicitly initialized at the time of object creation. Uninitialized final field is called blank final field. Okay, in the normally global variable means outside from the methods, if you define any variable, that is called the global variable. If you not initialize that variable, or you don't assign any value to that variable, so at the time of the object creation it will get the default value. But if you define a variable or a global variable as a final, that variable will not get the default value at the creation of object. You need to compulsory initialize that field in the constructor or in the initialization block. Suppose here we have create a class A and we create a global variable, non-final global variable. No need to initialize them. But for the value, final variable, you need to initialize within the constructor. Final global variable must get a value at the time of object creation, otherwise it will throw the error. So if you create the object, you need to assign the value for the j. If you not assign the value for the j, it will throw the compile time error. Let's I show you on the Eclipse IDE. So first I remove it. Okay, so this is I have defined a non-static global variable now, or I am not initializing it. Okay, I define final int j, and it is also I am not initializing. So it is showing an error because we need to compulsory initialize it before object creation. Okay, so now I am initializing it in the constructor. J equal to 10. Now if I create the object test t equal to new test. Okay, now I am printing the value of I and j. I if you run it, you will get the output 0 and 10. So 0 is the default value for the I, and j is we have to initialize explicitly. If we not initialize it and try to run it, it will throw the compilation error. The blank final field j may not have been initialized. Now the point number 8 is final non-static global variable must be initialized at the time of declaration or all in the constructor or in the any one of the IIB instance initialization block. Okay, if you define a final non-static global variable, so that final non-static global variable means without static keywords, only with the final keywords. If you define, then you need to initialize within the uh, instance block or within the constructor. You can initialize in within any constructor, whether it can be parameterized constructor or within the default constructor. Okay, I hope this point is well understood. In the previous point, we have covered this. So we go for the next point. Next point is final static global variable. What is the final static global variable? Means a variable defined with the final and static keywords both. At the time of the declaration, or it may be initialize any one of static initialization block. Means if you define a final static variable, then you need to initialize that in the static block. Otherwise, it will throw the error. Either you can initialize here at the declaration time, or you can initialize it in the static block. And the keep one thing in mind, final static global variable cannot be initialized in the constructor. You cannot initialize uh, the final static global variable into the constructor. Why? Because static is a class label. Static fields executed or initialized at the time of the class loading, and the constructor create after the loading the class, and static block execute at the class loading time. So if we want to assign the value to the static variable, we perform the initialization at the time of class loading. So the class loading activity performed by the static block. That is why we can initialize static final variable only in the static block, not in the constructor. Next point is final. Okay, this was the same. 10th point is the global variable which is declared as final and static remains unchanged for the whole execution, because static members are stored in the class memory and they are loaded only once in the whole execution. They are common to all objects of the class. If you declare static variables as final, any of the objects cannot change their value as it is final. Therefore, variables declared as final and static are sometimes referred to as a constant. All fields of interface are referred as constant because they are final and static by default. So if you define a variable final and static, so this considered as a constant value. Constant value. So these are the 10 points about the final variable. So friends, thank you for watching this video lecture. I hope you clear all the concept related to the final keywords. Thank you for watching this video lecture, and watch my next video lecture for learning new things in Java.